The morning fog clung to the rolling hills near Arracourt, France, on September 19, 1944. Inside the cramped turret of an M4 Sherman tank, Sergeant William Morphew scanned the tree line ahead, his breath visible in the cold dawn air. The engine rumbled beneath him, a familiar vibration that had carried him from Normandy through 2 months of brutal hedgerow fighting. He'd lost 3 crews in that time, 3 different men who'd sat where his loader sat now, and every single one had died the same way: a flash of light, the screech of German steel punching through American armor, then fire. Morphew had learned something in those weeks, something the training manuals back in Fort Knox had never taught him. The Sherman wasn't invincible. It wasn't even particularly good at killing the newest German tanks, but it could do something the Germans couldn't. It could fight smart, and on this foggy morning, with reports of Panther tanks moving through the valley ahead, fighting smart was about to become the difference between survival and burning alive in a metal coffin. The radio crackled. His company commander's voice cut through the static. "Mount tanks now. Move guns a-blazing. All guns a-blazing." Morphew looked at his gunner. They both knew what that meant. Somewhere in the mist ahead, 45 tons of German engineering waited the Panther, a tank that could kill them from 2,000 yards away before they could even see where the shot came from. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But Morphew had a secret, a trick he'd learned not from any officer or field manual, but from staying alive when he shouldn't have. The Sherman couldn't win a fair fight against a Panther, so he'd stopped fighting fair. To understand how American tank crews discovered this life-saving adaptation, we need to understand just how outmatched they were. And more importantly, we need to understand why nobody in command seemed to believe it mattered. In the summer of 1944, as Allied armies poured across France following the D-Day landings, American tankers carried with them an institutional confidence that bordered on delusion. The M4 Sherman had been the pride of American industrial might since 1942. Nearly 50,000 had rolled off assembly lines from Detroit to Lima, Ohio. It was reliable, it was fast, and against the early German Panzer IIIs and IVs encountered in North Africa, it had been adequate, even good. The Sherman's designers had built it with clear priorities: mobility, reliability, and ease of production. Its designers had consciously limited its weight to 30 tons later. Variants would creep up to 34 specifically, so it could cross European bridges, fit through railroad tunnels, and be transported in standardized cargo ships. The tank needed to get to the war. That was the calculus. Everything else came second. The main gun reflected this philosophy. The 75mm M3 gun was a proven design, a decent dual-purpose weapon that could fire high-explosive shells to support infantry or armor-piercing rounds against enemy tanks. At 100 yards, firing the M61 armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round, it could penetrate 88mm of steel. At 1,000 yards, that penetration dropped to 73mm, perfectly adequate for the Panzer IV, which mounted 100mm of frontal armor. Barely adequate, but adequate nonetheless. The armor told the same story. The Sherman's frontal hull armor was 51mm thick, later increased to 64mm on improved models, set at a 56-degree slope. The turret front ranged from 76 to 91mm depending on the variant. The designers had done the math. They'd studied the German tanks. They'd concluded the Sherman was good enough. But the Germans had done their math too, and they'd been doing it while fighting the Soviet T-34 on the Eastern Front. The Panzer Kampfwagen V, the Panther, entered production in January 1943 as a direct response to the T-34. German engineers had looked at Soviet tank design and seen the future. Sloped armor, a high-velocity gun, wide tracks for mobility. They'd taken these lessons and built something terrifying. The Panther mounted a 75mm KK-42 liters, 70 high-velocity gun. The L-70 designation meant the barrel was 70 times the diameter of the bore, a long, powerful gun that could propel an armor-piercing round at nearly 3,000 feet per second. At 100 yards, it could punch through 185 millimeters of steel. At 1,000 yards, it could still penetrate 149 millimeters. The Sherman's frontal armor? 64 millimeters at best, even with the slope. The math was brutal and simple. A Panther could kill a Sherman from any angle at any battlefield distance. A Sherman could only penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at point-blank range, if it was lucky, if it aimed for specific weak points, and if the German crew made a mistake. The Panther's frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees. The laws of physics were merciless. When the Sherman's 75mm round hit that sloped plate, it was encountering the equivalent of nearly 200 millimeters of armor. The shell would simply bounce off, leaving nothing but a scar on the German tank's glacis plate and a bright muzzle flash that told every German gun crew exactly where to aim. American tankers began to notice this disparity in the hedgerows of Normandy. After the initial beachhead was secured, Allied armor pushed inland into the bocage country, a nightmare landscape of sunken roads, high hedgerows, and tiny fields that turned every advance into a close quarters ambush. In this terrain, the Panther's advantages should have been negated. Range didn't matter when you couldn't see more than 50 yards, but the Panthers were there, waiting in carefully prepared positions, and they were killing Shermans at an alarming rate. Lieutenant Colonel Alban Ierzik, who commanded a tank battalion in Patton's Third Army, later recalled the grim reality. Many a Sherman was lost in endeavouring to get close in, which was necessary in order for them to strike a telling blow. The average engagement range in tank versus tank combat, the Army noted, was 800 to 900 yards. At that distance, a Panther could see a Sherman, identify it, aim, and fire with confidence. The Sherman, meanwhile, knew that even if it fired first and hit, the round would likely do nothing except reveal its position. The psychological impact was devastating. Tank crews began to dread encounters with Panthers. Some units reported taking 50% casualties before even spotting where enemy fire was coming from. The Sherman's high silhouette design and the high flash powder in its shells made every shot a beacon. Fire once, and every German gunner within 1,000 yards knew exactly where you were. Crew survivability became a dark obsession. Early Sherman models had ammunition stored in sponsons around the fighting compartment. When an armor-piercing round penetrated the hull, it often ignited this ammunition, turning the tank into what crews called a Ronson, a reference to the cigarette lighter company's slogan, "Lights every time." Studies conducted during the war found that between 55 and 80% of Shermans caught fire after being penetrated. The escape hatches, while improved in later models, still required precious seconds to open. Most men who died in knocked-out Shermans never made it out. And yet, American commanders insisted the Sherman was adequate. General George S. Patton, the Army's most vocal armor advocate, famously argued that tanks were not supposed to fight other tanks but bypass them if possible and attack enemy objectives in the rear. This was doctrine talking. American armored doctrine held that tank destroyers, specialized vehicles with bigger guns and thinner armor, would handle enemy tanks. Shermans were for exploitation, for breaking through and wreaking havoc in the rear areas. But doctrine and reality had diverged somewhere between the planning rooms in Washington and the hedgerows of France. Tank destroyers were often unavailable, committed elsewhere, or simply too few. And the Germans weren't cooperating with American doctrine. They were putting Panthers in every defensive position that mattered. Sherman crews couldn't bypass what they couldn't avoid. They had to fight, and they were dying. The U.S. Army's intelligence failure compounded the problem. Planners had predicted that Panthers would be rare, that German industry couldn't possibly produce them in meaningful numbers. They were catastrophically wrong. By September 1944, Germany was producing roughly 300 Panthers per month. When American armored divisions rolled into France, they encountered Panthers not as rare superweapons, but as the standard medium tank of the German armored force. The infantry didn't help matters. GIs on the ground couldn't always tell a Panzer IV from a Panther, let alone a Panther from a Tiger. Every German tank became a tiger in the reports, creating a fog of exaggeration that made it difficult for commanders to understand the real threat. But the men in the Shermans knew. They could hear the difference between a Panzer IV's round glancing off their armour and a Panther's round punching clean through. So they adapted, not through official channels, not through new equipment or updated tactics manuals, but through the grim mathematics of survival. Crews who lived long enough to learn began to notice things, began to experiment, began to share what worked. One of the first lessons was simple: never fight a Panther head-on. This wasn't cowardice, it was physics. The Sherman's 75mm gun simply couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armour at combat ranges. But from the side? The Panther's side armour was only 40 to 50mm thick. A Sherman could punch through that from 500 yards or more. The rear was even weaker. This led to the development of what became known as fire and movement tactics. A Sherman platoon, typically 5 tanks, would split into 2 sections. One section would expose itself, drawing the German tank's attention and fire. While the Panther engaged this decoy, the other section would maneuver to the flank, racing through whatever cover was available: a tree line, a depression in the ground, the ruins of a farm building to get a shot at the Panther's vulnerable side armour. It worked, but it came at a cost. The decoy section was genuinely at risk. Drawing fire from a Panther wasn't a safe job. Loss ratios in these engagements ran as high as 3-1, 4-1, sometimes 5-1 in favour of the Germans. For every Panther killed, 3 to 5 Shermans might be lost, but American logistics could sustain those losses. German logistics couldn't. By late 1944, every Panther lost was irreplaceable. Every Sherman lost was replaced within days, sometimes hours. But some crews discovered something better, something that didn't require sacrificing tanks to win. They discovered that the Sherman had advantages the Panther didn't, subtle advantages that the designers probably never imagined would matter, advantages that, when used correctly, could turn a losing fight into a winning one. The key was in the gun, not the caliber of the gun or its penetrating power, but in how the gun could move. The Sherman's gun mount had 12 degrees of depression. That meant the gunner could aim the barrel 12 degrees below horizontal. For most tank crews, this was just a technical specification, something mentioned in the manual, and promptly forgotten. But 12 degrees of depression was extraordinary. The Panther, by comparison, had only 8 degrees. Some early models had even less. Soviet tanks had only 5 degrees of depression, which was why Soviet tank doctrine emphasized fighting on flat terrain where depression didn't matter. 12 degrees didn't sound like much, but in the rolling terrain of France, in the Vosges foothills near Arracourt, in any landscape with hills and ridges and depressions, 12 degrees of gun depression meant the Sherman could do something revolutionary. It could fight from behind cover and still shoot downhill. The tactic had a name in military terminology: hull down. It was an old concept from naval warfare, when ships would position themselves so only their gun turrets were visible over the horizon. Tanks could do the same thing with terrain. Position yourself on the reverse slope of a hill, just behind the crest, and only your turret would be exposed to the enemy. The entire hull, the vulnerable part of the tank where the ammunition was stored, where the driver sat, where a penetrating hit meant fire and death, would be protected by the earth itself. But hull down only worked if your gun could depress enough to shoot down the forward slope of the hill. If you couldn't aim down far enough, you'd have to advance farther forward over the crest, exposing more of your hull to enemy fire. The Panther, with its limited gun depression and low-profile turret, had to expose itself to use hull-down positions effectively. The Sherman didn't, and once American crews realized this, everything changed. Sergeant Morphew had learned the trick outside of Avranches in early August. His platoon had been advancing up a ridge when they'd taken fire from a Panther positioned in a tree line 800 yards away. Standard doctrine would have been to split up and flank. But Morphew's lieutenant had seen the terrain, a series of rolling hills that gave them cover and height advantage, and called for something different. Back down to the reverse slope, the lieutenant had ordered. Hull down position, We'll wait for him to come looking. They'd reversed down the hill until only the Sherman's turret protruded over the crest. The gunner could still see down into the valley where the Panther sat, could still aim, could still fire, but from the German perspective, the Sherman had disappeared. All that was visible was a tiny portion of turret and the black circle of the gun barrel. When the Panther crew finally grew impatient and advanced to investigate, they exposed their side armor as they angled through the tree line. 3 Shermans in hull-down positions opened fire simultaneously. The Panther burned. Nobody in the platoon had died, nobody had even been hit, and word spread. By September, informal training was happening at company level. Experienced tank commanders were teaching new crews the same lesson. Don't advance up and over a ridge. Advance to the military crest, the point just below the actual crest where you could still see over, then stop. If you had to move, reverse backward down the hill. The Sherman's transmission gave it a respectable reverse speed in first gear, not as fast as forward, but fast enough. Fast enough to duck behind cover, reload, and then creep forward again for another shot. This was when crews made another discovery. One that seemed almost accidental but changed everything. The Sherman had a vertical stabilizer for its main gun. It was a crude system by later standards, a gyroscopic mechanism that tried to keep the gun aimed at the same point even as the tank moved. It didn't work well enough to shoot accurately on the move. No World War II tank could do that reliably, but it did keep the gun roughly on target. This meant a Sherman could peek over a ridge, fire, and immediately reverse back into cover, all while keeping the gun pointed at the target. The crew could stay in hull down, relatively safe, and use a kind of shoot-and-scoot tactic that later generations would call peekaboo. The Panther had no stabilizer. Its crew had to stop, traverse the turret manually, aim carefully, then fire. If the target disappeared, they had to reacquire it. The Sherman crew could fire, reverse, reload while hidden, then creep forward and fire again. The Panther crew would see a gun barrel appear, see the muzzle flash, then see nothing. By the time they'd adjusted their aim, the Sherman would pop up somewhere else along the ridge. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological impact reversed. Now it was German crews who felt helpless, who couldn't get a clean shot, who watched their rounds slam into hillsides while American shells found their marks. The loss ratios began to change, not everywhere, not in every engagement, but in enough places to matter. Units that mastered hull-down tactics reported dramatically improved survival rates. Some tank companies that had been losing 3 or 4 tanks for every Panther kill began evening the score, killing Panthers at nearly 1-to-1 ratios when they controlled the terrain. The Battle of Arracourt became the proof of concept. On September 18, 1944, German 5th Panzer Army launched a counter-offensive near the small town of Arracourt in the Lorraine region of northeastern France. Hitler himself had ordered the attack. General George Patton's Third Army had advanced too far, too fast. Their supply lines were stretched thin. The Moselle River bridgehead at Duloir represented a dagger pointed at the German industrial heartland. It had to be eliminated. General Hasso von Manteuffel assembled a formidable force, 262 tanks and assault guns, including 107 brand-new Panther tanks, fresh from the factories. The German High Command was confident. These weren't the battle-weary remnants of units decimated in Normandy. These were new formations, the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, equipped with the best tanks Germany could produce. On paper, they outnumbered and outgunned the American forces holding Arracourt. Facing them was Combat Command A of the U.S. 4th Armored Division, under Colonel Bruce C. Clark. The 4th Armored had earned a reputation as one of the finest American armored units in Europe. They'd been first into Avranches, first across the Seine, but reputation didn't change the fact that they were equipped primarily with M4 Shermans mounting the 75mm gun, and they were outnumbered. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the men of the 4th Armoured had spent the past 3 months learning lessons written in the blood of less fortunate units. They'd learned what worked against Panthers. More importantly, they'd learned what got you killed. The morning of September 19th dawned cold and foggy. A thick blanket of mist settled over the rolling hills around Arracourt, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. For the Americans, this was a blessing. The Panther's greatest advantage, its ability to kill at extreme range, was negated. For the Germans, it was a tactical disaster they didn't recognize until too late. The 5th Panzer Army had been assembled so hastily that it lacked proper reconnaissance units. German doctrine relied on light armored vehicles to scout ahead of tank formations, identifying enemy positions before the panzers committed. But there were no scouts. Fuel shortages and the chaos of retreat from Normandy had left the German army fragmented and disorganized. The new Panther brigades would have to advance blind into the fog. At 8 in the morning, company-sized elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade punched through American outposts on the eastern and southern approaches to Arracourt. The fog was so thick that German tank commanders stood in their open hatches, straining to see anything through the swirling grey. They advanced in a loose column formation down country roads, confident that their armour and firepower would carry the day once they made contact. What they didn't know was that American tank destroyers and Shermans were already in position, occupying carefully selected hull-down positions on ridges overlooking the roads. Colonel Clark had used the previous weeks to scout every hill, every depression, every piece of terrain around Arracourt. His crews knew the ground, the Germans didn't. Captain Jimmy Leach commanded B Company of the 37th Tank Battalion. His Shermans were spread across a ridge south of Arracourt, engines idling, crews tense. Through his periscope, Leach caught movement in the fog, dark shapes materializing like ghosts, panthers, at least a dozen of them, advancing in line down the Arracourt-Rechicourt road. Leach keyed his radio. "All units, hold fire. Let them get closer." The Panthers were at 800 yards, well within their killing range but still obscured by fog. At 600 yards, Leach could make out details: the long gun barrels, the distinctive sloped armour. At 400 yards, he could see German tank commanders standing in their hatches, scanning the fog for targets they couldn't see. Fire! 11 Sherman guns spoke almost simultaneously. The fog lit up with muzzle flashes. Armour-piercing rounds streaked through the mist at 2,000 feet per second. At 400 yards, even the Sherman's stubby 75mm gun could penetrate a Panther's side armour. 3 German tanks exploded immediately. 2 more lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from their engine decks. The rest of the German formation scattered in confusion. But Leach's Shermans weren't sitting still. Even as they fired, they were reversing down the ridge, pulling back into hull-down positions where only their turrets remained visible over the crest. By the time the surviving Panthers had oriented themselves and returned fire, the Americans had disappeared back into cover. German rounds screamed overhead, detonating harmlessly on the far side of the ridge. The Panther gunners were firing at muzzle flashes, at memory, at ghosts. They couldn't see the hulls of the American tanks. They couldn't see anything to hit. Leach's Shermans crept forward again. The turrets rose over the crest like predators surfacing. Another volley. 2 more Panthers hit. Then, back into cover, reversing at 8 miles per hour, the squealing of tracks drowned out by the thunder of guns. First Lieutenant Merwin Marston commanded 3rd Platoon. He'd split his 5-tank section into 2 groups, one on the road itself, one in a support position to the north. When the Panthers tried to flank around Leach's position, they ran directly into Marston's ambush. His Shermans were in defilade behind a stone wall, only their guns visible. The Panthers never saw what hit them. They abandoned the battlefield, Captain Leach would later report with barely concealed satisfaction. They put those things in high gear, those Panther tanks, and they took off over a hill and disappeared. The vaunted German armour, superior in every measurable way, had been routed by tanks they should have destroyed with ease. But this wasn't luck. This was the culmination of lessons learned the hard way. The Americans had chosen the battlefield. They'd used terrain to negate the Panthers' range advantage. They'd employed hull-down positions to protect their vulnerable hulls. And critically, they'd used the Sherman's superior gun depression to maintain firing positions that would have been impossible for Panthers to replicate. A Panther trying to fight from hull down on these ridges would have had to expose more of its hull to depress its gun enough to engage targets on the forward slope. The Sherman could tuck itself behind the military crest and still bring its gun to bear. It was a 3 or 4 degree difference in gun depression. In tank combat, 3 degrees was the difference between life and death. The fighting continued for 11 days. Again and again, German Panzer units attacked. Again and again, they found themselves advancing into killing zones, where American tanks waited in prepared positions. The fog persisted through the first several days, negating German range advantage and forcing close-quarters fighting where American tactics and training proved superior. On September 20th, German tanks attempted to take Hill 318, a critical terrain feature overlooking CCA headquarters. A company of Shermans from the 8th Tank Battalion counterattacked, but found themselves in the open against entrenched Panthers. The Americans were taking casualties when the weather finally broke. The fog lifted. Within minutes, P-47 Thunderbolts from the XIEC Tactical Air Command arrived over the battlefield like avenging angels. The fighter bombers didn't just drop bombs. They rocketed the German positions, strafed them with 50 caliber machine guns, and most critically forced the Panthers to move. German tank commanders had to choose between staying in position to fight American tanks or scattering to avoid air attack. Most chose to scatter. And moving Panthers were vulnerable Panthers. American artillery observers called in fire missions. The 66th and 94th Armored Field Artillery Battalions had pre-registered their guns on likely German approach routes. Now they dropped 105mm shells on moving tank columns. The explosions couldn't penetrate a Panther's armor, but they could damage tracks, destroy optics, wound exposed crew members, and most importantly, create chaos. Into this chaos came the Shermans. While German crews dealt with air attack and artillery, American tanks advanced from hull-down positions, firing as they moved, using their stabilizers to keep guns roughly on target. They shot for the sides and rear of Panthers that had turned to avoid airstrikes. They shot for Panthers that had stopped to return artillery fire. They shot for anything that presented a vulnerable angle. Staff Sergeant James Berets commanded 2nd Platoon of B Company. On the afternoon of September 19th, his 5 Shermans took up blocking positions south of the Arracourt-Rechicourt Road. Intelligence reported 14 Panthers approaching, 14 against 5. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a massacre. But Berets' platoon wasn't fighting under normal circumstances. They were in hull down, on terrain they'd scouted days earlier, with artillery support on call and P-47 seconds overhead. When the Panthers appeared, advancing in a loose line formation, the Americans opened fire. Not aimed shots at individual tanks, but volume fire, all 5 Shermans shooting as fast as their loaders could ram shells into the breaches. The Panthers returned fire, but they were shooting at turrets peeking over ridges, small targets that disappeared and reappeared. Several Shermans took hits, glancing blows off the turret mantlet that rang like church bells but didn't penetrate. The Panthers, meanwhile, were exposed, and when American armor-piercing rounds found their sides, they penetrated. 8 Panthers burned in 30 minutes. The survivors retreated. Berets' platoon suffered 1 tank damaged, repairable. Not 1 American crewman died in that engagement. This pattern repeated across the Arracourt battlefield. German units with superior equipment found themselves unable to bring that superiority to bear. They advanced into fog without reconnaissance, exposing themselves to prepared positions. They fought on terrain that favored the defender. They faced an enemy that had learned how to negate their advantages through tactics and terrain. The statistics told the story. By September 29th, when the battle finally wound down, the Germans had lost approximately 200 tanks and assault guns. Some were destroyed outright by tank fire. Others were abandoned when they broke down and couldn't be recovered. Many fell victim to airstrikes. but the pattern was consistent. German armor that should have dominated instead was systematically destroyed. American losses were 48 tanks, 48 Shermans against 200 German armored vehicles. The loss ratio that had haunted American tankers since Normandy 3-1, 4-1, 5-1 in favor of the Germans had reversed. At Arracourt, it was better than 4-1 in favor of the Americans. And it wasn't just the numbers. It was what those numbers represented. The myth of German tank invincibility had been shattered. Sherman crews, who had dreaded encounters with Panthers, now had proof that superior tactics could overcome superior equipment. The tank that couldn't kill a Panther had killed scores of them. General Patton visited the battlefield after the fighting ended. He walked among the burned-out Panthers, many of them barely scratched on their frontal armor but with gaping holes in their sides and rears. He spoke with the tank crews, listened to their stories of hull-down fighting and reverse movement. According to witnesses, he said little, but Third Army's approach to tank combat changed after Arracourt. The emphasis on flanking maneuvers intensified. Training on hull-down positions became standard. And perhaps most importantly, the doctrine that tanks should avoid other tanks was quietly forgotten. Colonel Alben Irzik, who commanded the 8th Tank Battalion at Arracourt, later wrote about the battle's lessons. Often, a good American gunner could get off 3 or 4 rounds before the first German round, he noted. This wasn't because American guns were faster, they weren't. It was because American crews weren't trying to get the first penetrating hit. They were trying to blind, confuse, and suppress the enemy while maneuvering for a killing shot. The tactic of using white phosphorus shells exemplified this approach. The 75mm gun had white phosphorus rounds originally intended as artillery markers. Sherman crews discovered that hitting a Panther's frontal armor with white phosphorus might not penetrate, but the burning chemical would blind the German optics, obscure vision blocks, and suck acrid smoke into the vehicle through the ventilation system. Panther crews sometimes abandoned perfectly functional tanks simply because they couldn't see and couldn't breathe. This was fighting smart. This was using every advantage terrain, tactics, combined arms, even chemical smoke to overcome a material disadvantage. The Germans had built a better tank. The Americans had built better tank crews. The impact of Arracourt rippled through both armies. For the Americans, it provided a template for defensive tank combat that would be used throughout the Battle of the Bulge 3 months later. When German armoured spearheads drove into the Ardennes in December 1944, they encountered American tank units that immediately fell back to hull-down positions on favourable terrain, refused to be drawn into fair fights, and used the same tactics that had worked at Arracourt. For the Germans, Arracourt represented the beginning of the end for their armoured forces in the West. The 5th Panzer Army never recovered from the losses sustained in those 11 days. The new Panther brigades were effectively destroyed in their first major engagement. Worse, the battle had demonstrated that even when German units had local superiority and equipment advantages, they could no longer guarantee victory. The institutional experience that had made the Wehrmacht so formidable in the war's early years was draining away. Veteran crews were dead or on the Eastern Front. Replacement crews had weeks of training instead of months. They knew how to drive and shoot, but not how to fight. By contrast, American armoured units were getting better. Every veteran crew that survived meant accumulated experience that could be passed to newer crews. Every tactical innovation that worked hull-down fighting, reverse movement, combined arms coordination, spread through the armoured force. The industrial base that had produced 50,000 Shermans also produced an endless stream of replacement parts, ammunition, and fuel. American tanks that were damaged in the morning could be repaired by evening. German tanks that broke down were abandoned. The Sherman itself continued to evolve. By late 1944, more and more units were receiving the M4A3 variant with the 76mm gun. This longer, higher-velocity weapon still couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at range, but it dramatically improved the Sherman's ability to kill from the side and rear. It could also penetrate the frontal armor of the Panzer IV and Tiger I at combat ranges. The M4A3E8 EZ8, appeared in early 1945 with wider tracks, improved suspension, and a horizontal volute spring system that gave it better cross-country mobility. The M4A3E2 jumbo assault tank featured massively increased armor up to 177 mm on the front, though it retained the 75 mm gun. But these improvements, welcome as they were, only reinforced what Arracourt had already proven. The Sherman's real strength wasn't in its armor or gun. It was in its reliability, its tactical flexibility, and the quality of the crews who operated it. A tank that could be in 5 different places on the battlefield, that could appear and disappear behind cover, that could coordinate with infantry and artillery and air power, and that could be knocked out in the morning and back in action by afternoon. That tank was more valuable than a Panther that could kill from 2,000 yards, but couldn't advance without breaking down or running out of fuel. The tactic of fighting in reverse became so ingrained in American armor doctrine that it influenced post-war tank design. The M26 Pershing, which arrived in small numbers by the war's end, had excellent gun depression. The M46, M47, and M48 Patton tanks that followed all featured outstanding gun depression and reverse speeds. The M60 and the M1 Abrams continued this tradition. American tank designers had learned the lesson. If you can't have the best armor and the biggest gun, make sure you can choose your battles, use terrain effectively, and survive long enough to take the kill shot. Soviet designers learned different lessons. The T-54, T-55, T-62, and T-72 all featured low profiles and excellent frontal armor, but terrible gun depression, often only 4 or 5 degrees. These tanks were designed for fighting on the flat plains of Central Europe, where hull-down positions would be rare. When Soviet-supplied tanks faced Western-trained crews in hilly terrain in the Golan Heights in 1973, in Lebanon in 1982, in Iraq, in 1991 they consistently lost, often to inferior numbers, because they couldn't effectively use terrain for protection. The men who fought at Arracourt didn't know they were establishing doctrines that would influence tank combat for the next 50 years. They were just trying to stay alive. They'd learned that the Sherman couldn't win a fair fight against a Panther, so they stopped fighting fair. They learned that movement and positioning mattered more than armor thickness. They learned that a tank that could shoot and disappear was harder to kill than a tank that stood still and slugged it out. Sergeant William Morphew survived Arracourt. He survived the advance to the German border. He survived the Battle of the Bulge, where his mastery of hull-down tactics saved his crew on multiple occasions. He made it home to Ohio in 1945, married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about the war. When he did, in the last years of his life, he would talk about the cold morning near Arracourt, when his platoon had destroyed 3 Panthers without taking a casualty. "We learned to fight backwards," he told his grandson in 1998. "The Sherman wasn't supposed to reverse into battle. That's not what the manual said, but the manual never fought a Panther. We did, and we figured out that if you could shoot and disappear, eventually you'd get them. They couldn't hit what they couldn't see, and we made damn sure they couldn't see us." That simple insight, shoot and disappear, crystallized everything Sherman crews had learned. The hull-down position protected you. The reverse gear got you back into cover. The gun depression let you shoot downhill while staying protected. The stabilizer kept your gun roughly on target while you moved, and the crew coordination, the training, the willingness to innovate and adapt, turned a technically inferior tank into a tactically superior weapon. The Sherman didn't win World War II because it was better than the Panther. It won because the men who crewed it were better than their counterparts, and because they fought smarter. They turned weaknesses into advantages, used terrain like another piece of armor, and proved that in war, the best tank isn't the one with the thickest armor or the biggest gun. It's the tank that's in the right place, at the right time, with the right crew. By war's end, American tank crews had mastered an art form, the art of fighting from disadvantage and winning anyway, the art of using mobility and terrain to offset material inferiority. The art of fighting in reverse when advancing would get you killed. It wasn't glamorous, It didn't make for dramatic photographs, but it worked. And in the brutal mathematics of armored combat, working was all that mattered. The Sherman's legacy isn't the tiger hunting myth or the death trap reputation. It's this: a generation of tank crews who learned that survival required innovation, that tactics could overcome technology, and that the best way to fight a superior enemy was to never give them the fair fight they wanted. They fought backwards when doctrine said advance. They hid when honor said stand and fight. And they won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.